Nearly everybody I knew talked to me about God. They always warned me not to offend him. But when Grace talked about God, she touched my cheek and said that he loved me and watched over me. Remembering what Grace had said, I lay in bed at night, crying myself to sleep. The only one who loved me and watched over me was someone I couldn't see or hear or touch. I used to draw pictures of God whenever I had time. In my pictures, he looked a little like Aunt Grace and a little like Clark Gable. As I grew older, I knew I was different from the other kids because there were no kisses or promises in my life. I often felt lonely and wanted to die. I would try to cheer myself up with daydreams. I compromised by dreaming of my attracting someone's attention, besides God, of having people look at me and say my name. This wish for attention had something to do, I think, with my trouble in church on Sundays. No sooner was I in the pew with the organ playing and everybody singing a hymn than the impulse would come to me to take off all my clothes. I wanted desperately to stand up naked for God and everyone else to see. I had to clench my teeth and sit on my hands to keep myself from undressing. Sometimes I had to pray hard and beg God to stop me from taking my clothes off. I even had dreams about it. In the dream, I entered the church wearing a hoop skirt with nothing under it. The people would be lying on their backs in the church aisle, and I would step over them, and they would look up at me. My impulse to appear naked in my dreams about it had no shame or sense of sin in them. Dreaming of people looking at me made me feel less lonely. I think I wanted them to see me naked because I was ashamed of the clothes I wore. The never-changing faded blue dress of poverty. Naked, I was like other girls, and not someone in an orphan's uniform. I daydreamed chiefly about beauty. I dreamed of myself becoming so beautiful that people would turn to look at me when I passed. I dreamed of myself walking proudly in beautiful clothes and being admired by everyone and overhearing words of praise. I never daydreamed about love, even after I fell in love for the first time. I fell in love with a boy named George, who was a year older. We used to hide in the grass together until he got frightened and jumped up and ran away. What we did in the grass never frightened me. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know what was wrong. At night, I lay awake and tried to figure out what sex was and what love was. Then one day, I found out about sex. I was almost 9 and I lived with a family that rented a room to a man named Kimmel. He was a stern-looking man and everybody respected him and called him Mr. Kimmel. I was passing his room when his door opened and he said quietly, "Please come in here, Norma." I thought he wanted me to run an errand. "Where do you want me to go, Mr. Kimmel?" I asked. "No place," he said, and closed the door behind me. He smiled at me and turned the key in the lock. "Now you can't get out," he said, as if we were playing a game. I stood staring at him. I was frightened, but I didn't dare yell. I knew if I yelled, I would be sent back to the orphanage in disgrace again. Mr. Kimmel knew this too. And he put his arms around me. I kicked and fought as hard as I could, but I didn't make any sound. He was stronger than I was. He wouldn't let me go. He kept whispering to me to be a good girl. When he unlocked the door and let me out, I ran to tell my aunt what Mr. Kimmel had done. "I want to tell you something," I stammered. "About Mr. Kimmel, She interrupted me. Don't you dare say anything against Mr. Kimmel. Mr. Kimmel's a fine man. He's my starboarder. Mr. Kimmel came out of his room and stood in the doorway, smiling. Shame on you, my aunt glared at me, complaining about my people. This is different, I began. This is something I have to tell Mr. Kimmel. I started stammering again and couldn't finish. Mr. Kimmel came up to me and handed me a nickel. Go buy yourself some ice cream, he said. I threw the nickel in Mr. Kimmel's face and ran out. I cried in bed that night and wanted to die. I thought, if there's nobody ever on my side that I can talk to, I'll start screaming. But I didn't scream. A week later, the family, including Mr. Kimmel, went to a religious revival meeting in a tent. The tent was jammed. Everybody was listening to the evangelist. He was half singing and half talking about the sinfulness of the world. Suddenly, he called on all the sinners in the tent to come up to the altar of God where he stood and repent. I rushed up ahead of everyone else and started telling about my sin. On your knees, sister, he said to me. I fell on my knees and began to tell about Mr. Kimmel and how he had molested me in his room. But other sinners crowded around me. They also fell on their knees and started wailing about their sins and drowned me out. I looked back and saw Mr. Kimmel standing among the non-sinners, praying loudly and devoutly for God to forgive the sins of others.